Tonight, let us slow everything down. Dim the lights. Let the noise of the day fade. And imagine stepping into a winter that does not care how prepared you feel. Tonight, we are traveling back to Christmas in early 1900s America, a time when the holiday season was not wrapped in convenience, comfort, or glow-in-the-dark decorations, but in cold air, stiff wool, and quiet determination. This is not the Christmas of cheerful jingles playing on repeat or thermostats set to perfect warmth. This is a Christmas shaped by survival first, celebration second. A season where warmth had to be earned, light had to be protected, and comfort was never guaranteed. Welcome to a Christmas where the cold was not just outside the window, it was everywhere. In the early 1900s, winter did not politely wait beyond the door. It crept in through cracks in the walls, slipped beneath loose floorboards, and pressed itself against every windowpane. Houses were built sturdy but imperfect, designed more for endurance than insulation. Even indoors, the air carried a sharp edge, especially in the quiet hours before dawn. Waking up on a December morning meant waking into cold that felt personal. Breath turned visible the moment it left your lips. Blankets were heavy and layered, often stitched together from years of fabric scraps, but even they could not fully keep the chill away. Frost sometimes formed on the inside of windows, delicate white patterns tracing the glass like quiet reminders that winter was very much in control. Getting out of bed was not a small decision. It required mental preparation. You stayed still for as long as possible, gathering courage, knowing that the moment your feet touched the floor, the cold would rise up to meet you. Floors were unforgiving wooden planks that had absorbed the night's chill and gave none of it back. Slippers waited nearby, if you were lucky, worn thin but better than bare skin against frozen boards. This was Christmas season, but it did not begin with music or gifts. It began with the basic task of staying warm. Heat did not arrive at the flick of a switch. It had to be made, carefully and patiently. Coal stoves sat at the center of most homes, hulking iron presences that could bring comfort or chaos depending on how they were handled. Before breakfast could happen, before hands could fully thaw, someone had to wake the fire. Matches were precious. Coal had to be measured. Kindling had to be placed just right. Too little effort and the stove stayed cold. Too much, and smoke filled the room, stinging eyes and throats. Children learned early to respect the stove not as an appliance, but as a force. It provided warmth, cooked meals, and kept winter at bay, but it demanded attention and care in return. While the fire struggled to catch, families stayed wrapped in layers, hovering near the kitchen, watching for the first sign of heat. The room smelled of coal dust, old wood, and yesterday's ashes. There was no rush, only routine. Christmas or not, the stove had to be fed, and winter always came first. Outside, the world was silent in a way modern winters rarely are. Snow absorbed sound, blanketing fields, streets, and rooftops in a hush broken only by distant footsteps or the creak of frozen branches. The cold air was clean and sharp, biting at exposed skin within seconds. A simple trip outside required planning boots, coats, scarves, mittens, each piece essential. In this world, cold shaped every part of daily life. It dictated how long you could stay still, how fast you worked, and how closely families gathered together. Bedrooms were shared not just for space, but for warmth. Bodies became sources of heat. Siblings slept close, blankets layered high, everyone breathing the same cold air, hoping the fire downstairs would still be alive come morning. Even Christmas traditions bent to winter's rules. Decorations were simple because excess required effort. Lights were candles, used sparingly and watched carefully. Trees were brought inside smelling of sap and snow, adding beauty but also another reminder of risk. Fire was both friend and threat, especially when paired with dry wood and flickering flames. Food reflected the season as well. Heavy, filling, designed to keep bodies fueled rather than impressed. Porridge, bread, root vegetables, meals chosen because they warmed from the inside out. Sugar and fresh produce were rare luxuries, saved for special moments. An orange in December was not just a snack. It was a small miracle, bright and fragrant in a season dominated by gray and white. Christmas cheer, in the modern sense, was subtle. There were no glowing streets or constant background noise. Instead, warmth came from shared spaces, familiar routines, and the knowledge that everyone around you was facing the same cold. Community mattered more when winter was harsh. Neighbors checked on one another. Families gathered close, not just for tradition, but for survival. And yet, within all of this hardship, something quietly remarkable existed. The cold sharpened appreciation. When warmth came, even briefly, it felt earned. The glow of the stove after hours of tending. The comfort of a full bowl after a long morning. The simple joy of sitting together in the evening, hands wrapped around mugs, listening to the fire settle into a steady rhythm. Christmas in early 1900s America was not about escape from winter. It was about enduring it together. There was no illusion that the season was easy. Everyone knew the challenges. But there was also a quiet pride in facing them. Surviving winter was a shared accomplishment, and Christmas marked a pause, a moment to acknowledge that, against the cold, against the darkness, people were still here. Still gathering. Still lighting fires. Still finding reasons to celebrate. And as the long nights stretched on, as the wind pressed against the walls and snow piled high outside, families held on to what mattered most. Not abundance. Not perfection. But warmth, persistence, and the simple comfort of knowing that, for another day, the fire was lit and everyone had made it through the cold. This was the true beginning of Christmas in 1900s America. Not wrapped in sparkle. But wrapped in survival. And from that cold foundation, everything else, traditions, gifts, laughter, and hope, slowly grew. To truly understand Christmas in early 1900s America, you have to let go of something modern life has quietly trained us to expect: ease. Back then, comfort was not built into the world. It had to be created, maintained, and constantly defended against the environment. Electricity, if it existed at all, was unreliable and limited. Many homes had none. Central heating did not exist. Indoor plumbing was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or the future. What we now consider basic necessities were, at the time, ambitious dreams. Daily life moved at the pace of human effort. Light did not arrive at the flip of a switch. When the sun went down, darkness filled rooms quickly and completely. Candles and oil lamps were precious, not decorative. Each flame had to be watched. Wicks trimmed. Fuel conserved. Shadows stretched long across walls, and the night felt closer, heavier, more present. Christmas evenings were quiet not because people chose silence, but because darkness encouraged it. Reading by lamplight strained the eyes. Sewing took patience. Writing letters meant working carefully, slowly, mindful of limited light and stiff fingers. Children learned early that when the lamp was out, the day was truly done. The night claimed the house. Heat followed the same rules. There was no steady warmth humming in the background. The house warmed unevenly, depending on proximity to the stove. Rooms far from the kitchen stayed cold, often unused during winter except for sleeping. Doors were kept closed not for privacy, but to trap what little heat existed. Hallways became frozen corridors. Bedrooms were cold sanctuaries entered only when necessary. Even water was not guaranteed. Without indoor plumbing, every drop had to be fetched by hand. Buckets were carried in from wells or pumps, sometimes through deep snow, sometimes through biting wind. Water froze easily, so timing mattered. Fetch too early, and it iced over before use. Fetch too late, and darkness made the trip dangerous. This meant that bathing, washing clothes, and even cooking were planned events, not casual routines. Bathing before Christmas was an ordeal, not a luxury. Water had to be hauled, heated slowly on the stove, and rationed carefully among family members. The tub was temporary, often placed in the kitchen. Privacy was minimal. Warmth was fleeting. Cleanliness was achieved briefly, then surrendered again to daily labor and coal dust. Still, people endured it, because appearing presentable for the holiday mattered. Food preparation reflected the same reality. There were no refrigerators humming quietly in the corner. Preservation was an ongoing challenge. Root cellars stored potatoes, turnips, and onions. Meats were salted or smoked. Milk was fresh only briefly. Everything was seasonal, local, and vulnerable to weather. Christmas meals were shaped by what survived the winter, not by recipes pulled from glossy magazines. Cooking required planning, patience, and constant attention to the stove. Miss a step, and food burned. Lose the fire, and dinner waited. Even on holidays, effort never fully paused. Time itself felt different. Without constant clocks, screens, or alerts, the day followed natural rhythms. Morning arrived with light. Evening came early. Winter compressed the usable hours, making every task feel more urgent. Christmas preparations were woven into daily chores, not separated from them. Decorations were made in stolen moments between work. Gifts were crafted slowly, often over weeks, using whatever materials were available. There was no instant gratification. No overnight shipping. No last-minute runs to brightly lit stores. The absence of convenience forced people to live with anticipation. Waiting became part of the experience. Christmas was not something that appeared suddenly. It emerged gradually, shaped by effort and expectation. Even communication moved slowly. Letters took weeks to arrive. News traveled by word of mouth or delayed print. Writing to Santa involved ink-stained fingers, careful handwriting, and faith in a distant system that might or might not deliver. The post office was a source of hope, but also uncertainty. Yet within this world without modern comforts, something quietly powerful existed. People were deeply aware of their surroundings. They listened to the wind, watched the sky, and noticed small changes in temperature and light. The environment was not background noise, it was an active participant in daily life. Winter demanded attention, and Christmas existed within its boundaries. Family life adjusted accordingly. Shared spaces mattered more than personal ones. People gathered where heat was available, where light was strongest. Conversations happened naturally because there was nowhere else to go. Entertainment was homemade stories, games, music, quiet companionship. The absence of distraction made presence unavoidable. Children did not disappear into separate worlds. Adults did not retreat behind closed doors. Everyone lived together in the same physical reality, shaped by cold, darkness, and routine. Christmas amplified this closeness. Not always comfortably, but meaningfully. The lack of modern comforts did not mean the absence of joy. It meant joy arrived differently. Warmth felt richer because it was earned. Light felt gentler because it was limited. Food tasted better because it required work. Small gifts carried weight because effort had been invested. Even silence had value, offering rest after long days of physical labor. Christmas in early 1900s America was not a performance. It was not optimized. It was not effortless. It was real. People did not compare their holiday to others online. They did not measure success by abundance. Instead, Christmas was measured by whether the house stayed warm, whether everyone ate, whether the fire stayed lit, whether family was present. In a world without modern comforts, The holiday became less about escape and more about endurance. Less about spectacle and more about steadiness. Less about perfection and more about persistence. And when Christmas finally arrived quietly, without flashing lights or constant sound, it felt grounded. Anchored. Honest. It belonged fully to the people living it, shaped by their hands, their patience, and their willingness to face winter without complaint. This was life before convenience softened the edges of existence. And in many ways, it made Christmas feel heavier, slower, and strangely more real. Morning in early 1900s America did not arrive gently, especially in December. It announced itself with cold. Not the kind of cold you notice and then forget, but the kind that settles into your bones before your eyes even open. Christmas morning, like every other winter morning, began long before warmth did. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, broken only by the faint creaks of wood contracting in the cold and the distant sound of wind pressing against the walls. You lay still beneath layers of quilts, not because you were lazy, but because movement required strategy. Every inch of exposed skin was a gamble. The air inside the bedroom was nearly as cold as the air outside, and your breath formed small clouds that drifted upward, disappearing into the darkness above the bed. Getting up was not automatic. It was a decision. You stayed wrapped tightly, gathering courage, listening for signs of life elsewhere in the house. Maybe the faint clatter of a stove door opening. Maybe footsteps on the stairs. If you were lucky, someone else was already awake, already braving the cold, already trying to coax warmth back into the building. Eventually, there was no avoiding it. You slid one foot out from beneath the blankets and immediately regretted it. The floorboards were frozen, stealing heat on contact. Slippers waited nearby, worn thin from years of use, but even they offered only partial protection. You moved quickly, because hesitation only made the cold worse. Dressing happened fast and without ceremony. There was no lingering in sleepwear. Nightshirts were shed, and layers went on one by one. Wool scratched. Cotton felt stiff. Buttons resisted numb fingers. Clothing was not chosen for appearance but for function. Every layer added a small measure of survival. Christmas morning did not change this routine. If anything, it made it more important. Before presents, before celebration, before anything that resembled joy, the house had to be made livable. Downstairs, the kitchen waited in shadow. The stove loomed in the center of the room, cold and silent, an iron reminder that warmth did not exist unless someone made it happen. The ashes from the night before were gray and lifeless. The room smelled faintly of coal dust and yesterday's meals. Lighting the stove was the most important task of the morning. It required patience and attention. Kindling was arranged carefully. Scraps of wood, old newspaper, anything that might catch quickly. Matches were struck with deliberate care, because they were not unlimited. Too weak a flame, and nothing happened. Too strong, and smoke filled the room, making eyes water and lungs protest. The first minutes were tense. Everyone hovered nearby, watching, waiting. Children clutched bowls, hoping breakfast would not be delayed. Adults offered advice, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. The stove demanded respect, and everyone knew it. When the fire finally caught, it was not dramatic. There was no sudden rush of warmth. Just a faint crackle, a small glow, a promise. Heat would come, eventually, but only if the fire was fed and watched. While the stove worked, the house slowly woke up. Someone fetched water from the bucket brought in the night before. Someone set out bowls, mismatched and chipped, each with its own history. Someone stirred porridge, thick and heavy, built to last through long hours of cold and work. Morning light crept through frosted windows, pale and weak. It did not flood the room. It hesitated, as if unsure whether it belonged. Ice traced delicate patterns along the glass, sparkling briefly before melting into nothing. Christmas morning looked much like any other winter morning at first glance. There were no glowing trees or colorful lights, yet no rush of excitement. Just routine, necessity, and quiet determination. Breakfast came slowly. Porridge was ladled into bowls, steaming faintly. Bread was sliced, often thick, sometimes stale, but filling. Coffee, if there was any, was weak and bitter, meant more to warm hands than delight the senses. Sugar was scarce. Butter, if present, was used sparingly. Everyone ate bundled in layers, close to the stove if possible. There was little talking at first. Mouths were busy. Fingers thawed gradually around warm bowls. The first moments of comfort arrived not as joy, but as relief. Only after breakfast did Christmas begin to separate itself from the rest of winter. Children's eyes drifted toward the corner where the tree stood, modest and slightly crooked. Presents waited beneath it, wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Stockings hung nearby, simple socks stretched wide with possibility. But even then, there was no rushing. Dishes had to be cleared. Fires had to be fed again. Chores still existed, even on Christmas. Water still needed fetching. Animals still needed tending. The cold did not pause for celebration. Morning rituals continued. Someone pulled on boots and stepped outside, breath catching in the cold air. Snow crunched underfoot. The world outside was still and bright, the kind of brightness that only winter creates. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and steady, marking homes where other families were doing the same thing: waking, working, surviving. Christmas morning stretched out slowly. Time felt thicker, heavier, unhurried. There was no schedule demanding efficiency. No clock counting down to an event. The day unfolded at the pace of human hands and limited daylight. When gifts were finally opened, it happened quietly. Everyone gathered, sitting close, knees pulled in, shoulders touching. Packages were opened carefully, string untied rather than torn. Newspaper crinkled softly. There was laughter, but it was gentle, restrained, wrapped in the understanding that these moments were fragile. A pair of mittens. A hand-carved toy. A book passed down from someone else. Each gift carried weight not because of cost, but because of effort. Because someone had made time, carved wood, stitched fabric, or saved something special. Morning moved on without urgency. Outside, the cold waited patiently. Inside, the stove continued its steady work. The house smelled of coal, food, and pine. Christmas did not explode into existence. It settled in, quietly, like warmth slowly filling a room. By midday, the worst of the cold loosened its grip slightly. Light strengthened. Hands moved more freely. Conversations grew easier. But the memory of the morning lingered: the cold floor, the stubborn stove, the careful layering. That was the foundation of Christmas in the early 1900s. Before joy came effort. Before celebration came survival. Before magic came routine. Morning rituals were not just habits. They were proof. Proof that another night had been endured. That the house still stood. That the fire still burned. That family was still together. And in a world where nothing was guaranteed, that was reason enough to celebrate. In early 1900s America, winter clothing was not about expression, style, or comfort in the modern sense. It was about defense. Every piece of clothing worn during Christmas season served one purpose above all others: keeping the cold out for as long as possible. There were no lightweight miracle fabrics, no thermal technology, no clever insulation designed to trap heat while allowing movement. What people had instead was wool. And more wool. And then some wool on top of that. Getting dressed in December was not a casual act. It was a process. The first layer went on before anything else had a chance to warm up. Long underwear, often a single-piece union suit, buttoned from neck to ankle. It was designed to trap heat and did its job well, but at the cost of flexibility and dignity. The fabric was thick, stiff, and often scratchy, especially after years of washing, patching, and reuse. Still, it stayed on, because removing it meant surrendering warmth. Over that came additional layers: long johns passed down from siblings, cotton or flannel shirts worn thin at the elbows, each one holding faint traces of soap, coal smoke, and last winter's labor. Nothing matched. Nothing needed to. What mattered was coverage. Movement was already becoming restricted. Trousers were heavy, often stiff from drying too close to the stove. They creaked slightly when bent and resisted sudden motion. Belts were pulled tight, not for fashion, but to seal warmth in. Shirts were tucked carefully, sleeves pushed down to cover wrists. Every exposed inch of skin was a liability. Then came the wool sweater. This was the layer everyone remembered. Thick, hand-knitted, and uncompromising. The sleeves rarely reached the wrists. The neck opening was often too small. Pulling it on required patience, contortions, and the quiet acceptance that this garment would itch for the rest of the day. The wool was coarse, sometimes uneven, but undeniably warm. It trapped air, absorbed moisture, and created a barrier against the cold that nothing else could. By the time this layer was on, the body felt heavier. Turning your head required effort. Bending your arms was no longer automatic. But warmth began to settle in, slowly, reluctantly, like a visitor deciding whether to stay. Next came socks. There were always more socks. The first pair was thin, usually cotton, worn soft from years of use. The second pair was wool, thick and scratchy, designed to insulate rather than comfort. Holes were common. Toes peeked through. Socks were rotated strategically so no single spot froze completely. Feet were wrapped, layered, and hoped for. Boots followed. Heavy leather, often lined with newspaper for extra insulation. They were stiff, cold to the touch, and difficult to pull on with numb fingers. Laces resisted tightening. Soles were thick and unforgiving. These boots were not made for walking far or fast. They were made to survive snow, slush, and frozen ground. By the time boots were secured, the transformation was complete. You were no longer dressed. You were armored. Scarves wrapped around necks, long enough to circle twice, sometimes 3 times. Wool again, always wool. They were tied tightly, sealing warmth in but also limiting movement. Breathing through the fabric warmed the air slightly before it reached the lungs, a small mercy against the biting cold. Mittens replaced gloves because fingers sharing warmth mattered more than dexterity. They were often mismatched, knitted by relatives whose eyesight had faded but whose determination had not. One thumb might be longer than the other. One mitten might be thicker. Both were worn gratefully. Hats went on last. Caps, wool hats, crocheted creations that pressed down on foreheads and trapped heat near the scalp. Ears were covered completely. Hair flattened. Vision slightly reduced. But warmth increased, and that was what mattered. By the time the outfit was complete, movement felt slow and deliberate. Walking required effort. Sitting required planning. Standing back up was a commitment. If you fell into the snow, you did not bounce lightly back to your feet. You rolled. You gathered yourself. You accepted help, if offered. But you were warm. That was the goal. Christmas did not change this routine. If anything, it intensified it. Church clothes were worn over layers. Sunday coats were heavier, longer, and no less restrictive. Dresses brushed the tops of boots. Ties pressed against stiff collars. Everyone looked formal and uncomfortable, and everyone accepted it. Fashion was a luxury for warmer months. In winter, especially at Christmas, survival dictated appearance. Children learned early that complaining did not remove layers. Adults reminded them that cold was worse than itchiness, worse than stiffness, worse than discomfort. And they were right. Cold did not negotiate. Inside the house, layers stayed on longer than we might expect today. The stove warmed only certain areas. Moving away from it meant temperature dropped sharply. Removing clothing meant shivering returned. So sweaters stayed on at the table. Scarves were loosened but not removed. Mittens rested nearby, ready to be pulled back on at a moment's notice. The house became a place of bundled figures moving slowly from room to room, brushing against furniture, knocking elbows gently, careful not to catch loose fabric on stove handles or chair legs. Christmas photos from the era show this clearly. People stand stiffly, faces calm, eyes serious, bodies wrapped in layers. Smiles are subtle. Posture is upright not for elegance, but because bending is difficult. Clothing shapes the way people exist in space. And yet, there is something grounding about it. The weight of clothing reminded people of their bodies, of effort, of presence. Warmth was not invisible. You felt it pressing in from every side, held in place by wool and fabric and careful layering. At night, undressing was another ritual. Layers came off slowly. Each removal released a wave of cold. Skin prickled. Goosebumps rose. Clothing was placed near the stove to dry for the next day, stiffening again by morning. Clean garments were limited. Reuse was expected. Then quilts replaced clothing. Thick, heavy, layered just like the outfits worn during the day. The body returned to stillness, warmth held in place by weight rather than wool. Christmas night ended as it began with careful management of heat. In this world, clothing was not a statement. It was a system. A system built over generations, refined by experience, passed down through habit rather than instruction. Everyone knew how to dress for winter because winter taught them. And at Christmas, when families gathered, when photos were taken, when memories were made, all of it happened within these layers. The stiffness. The weight. The scratch of wool against skin. It was not comfortable. But it was effective. And in a season, defined by cold, effectiveness mattered more than anything else. In early 1900s America, Christmas food was not designed to impress. It was designed to sustain. Meals during the winter months, especially around Christmas, served a very clear purpose: to keep bodies warm, strong, and capable of getting through long, cold days. Food was fuel first, comfort second, and celebration only a distant third. There were no elaborate menus, no endless side dishes, no expectation of abundance. What mattered was that the food lasted, filled the stomach, and carried enough energy to face the weather outside. Morning meals set the tone. Breakfasts were heavy and repetitive, built around ingredients that stored well and cooked easily over a coal stove. Porridge was common, thick and slow-simmered, made from oats or cornmeal. It arrived in bowls steaming faintly, dense enough to hold heat and hunger at bay for hours. The texture was not exciting, but that was not the point. Every spoonful delivered warmth from the inside out. Bread followed. Homemade loaves, often baked days earlier, sliced thick to make them last. The crusts were hard, the centers dense, but they were filling. Fresh bread was rare and treasured. Stale bread was normal and expected. It could always be softened in porridge or dipped into whatever liquid was available. Coffee, if present, was weak and bitter. It was stretched thin to serve many cups. Sugar was limited. Milk was not always reliable. The drink existed less for flavor and more for ritual: a warm mug in cold hands, something to sip while the stove slowly did its work. Children were usually given water or watered-down milk instead, if available. Christmas morning did not change these habits. Even on the holiday, breakfast came before gifts. Eating first was practical. No one wanted cold hands fumbling with packages on an empty stomach. Parents knew that excitement burned energy quickly, and winter did not forgive weakness. Midday meals followed a similar pattern. Potatoes appeared often, prepared in every imaginable way. Boiled, mashed, roasted, baked in ashes. Potatoes stored well in root cellars and provided reliable nourishment. Turnips, onions, carrots, and cabbage joined them, vegetables chosen not for color or variety, but for their ability to survive cold months underground. Meat was less common. When it appeared, it was used carefully. Salted pork, smoked ham, or small portions of poultry were stretched across meals. Nothing was wasted. Fat was saved. Bones were boiled for broth. Leftovers were expected and respected. Christmas dinner, when possible, was the most generous meal of the season, but even then, expectations were modest. A bird at the center of the table was a luxury. Sometimes it was turkey. Sometimes goose. Sometimes chicken pressed into service as something grander. The bird was roasted slowly, basted carefully, and carved with precision. Portions were measured with fairness. Everyone watched quietly to ensure balance. Stuffing was simple. Bread, onions, and whatever seasoning was available. Spices were rare and expensive, used sparingly. Gravy was thin, thickened with flour and hope, poured generously to add moisture and warmth. It did not dazzle the palate, but it completed the meal. Vegetables filled most of the table. Potatoes again, in multiple forms. Turnips softened by long cooking. Cabbage boiled until tender. Occasionally pickled beets or preserved vegetables appeared, bright and sharp, cutting through the heaviness of winter food. Bread circulated constantly. Each slice was valued. Dunked in gravy. Paired with butter if there was any. Butter was precious, rationed carefully, spread thinly. Bacon fat often took its place, saved from earlier meals and reused to add richness where possible. Dessert was not guaranteed. If it appeared, it was simple. Pies made from dried apples or preserved fruit. Sometimes molasses cookies. Sometimes something sweet saved, specifically for the holiday. Fruitcake, dense and enduring, often made an appearance, not always welcomed, but always present. Fruit itself was rare and meaningful. An orange in December was not casual. It carried brightness, scent, and memory of warmer months. It appeared in stockings, on tables, sometimes sliced and shared. It was both food and symbol, reminding everyone that summer still existed somewhere beyond the snow. Meals were eaten slowly. Not because people were savoring flavors, but because warmth encouraged stillness. Sitting near the stove was a privilege. Hands thawed around bowls. Conversation drifted quietly. The sound of spoons against dishes filled the room. Food created rhythm. Breakfast grounded the morning. Dinner marked survival of the day. Supper closed the evening. Christmas fit into this rhythm rather than interrupting it. The holiday did not excuse excess. It offered slight abundance within strict limits. Children learned early that food was not negotiable. You ate what was served. Complaints were discouraged. Waste was unacceptable. Hunger had been known before, and winter reminded everyone that nothing could be taken for granted. Yet, within this simplicity, comfort existed. There was comfort in consistency. In knowing what the meal would be. In recognizing the smell of porridge or potatoes as something familiar and safe. In sitting together, sharing warmth and routine. Food connected people. The act of eating together mattered more than what was on the plate. Christmas meals reinforced that connection. Even when portions were small. Even when choices were limited. The shared experience carried weight. After dinner, the house grew quieter. Full stomachs encouraged rest. The stove continued its steady work. Dishes were washed carefully, water used sparingly. Leftovers were stored with intention, planned for future meals. Nothing disappeared quickly. Food lingered. It was repurposed. It carried forward into the next day. Christmas did not end when the meal was finished. Its nourishment extended into the days that followed. In a world without abundance, food was honest. It did not promise more than it could deliver. It did not distract or overwhelm. It simply sustained. And in the heart of winter, that was enough. Christmas food in early 1900s America was not about indulgence. It was about endurance. About warmth. About sharing what existed and trusting that it would carry everyone through. It was quiet nourishment for a quiet season. In early 1900s America, winter did not slow work down. It increased it. Christmas arrived in the middle of the most physically demanding season of the year, and no holiday tradition could erase the simple truth that survival required constant effort. The cold did not excuse anyone from labor. If anything, it demanded more of it. Every day began with tasks that could not be postponed. Coal had to be carried in, often in heavy metal buckets that cut into cold hands and bumped against stiff legs. Wood had to be chopped, split, and stacked close to the house, because walking farther in deep snow wasted precious energy. Ashes from the stove had to be removed carefully, dumped outside, and replaced with fresh fuel. Miss one of these steps, and the house cooled quickly, punishing everyone inside. Christmas morning did not cancel these responsibilities. Before gifts, before meals, before rest, someone had to step outside. Boots crunched through snow. Breath turned to clouds. Muscles protested as buckets were lifted and doors were opened just long enough to let the cold rush in, sharp and immediate. Fetching water was among the hardest tasks. Without indoor plumbing, water was a daily negotiation with winter. Pumps froze. Handles stuck. Buckets grew heavier with every step back to the house. Fingers numbed quickly, even through mittens. Spilling water was unthinkable. Every drop mattered. Children were often given these tasks, not as punishment, but because everyone contributed. Age did not excuse effort. Strength was measured differently. Endurance mattered more than speed. The walk back from the pump was slow and careful. Snow shifted beneath boots. Ice hid beneath powder. One misstep could mean soaked clothing and a dangerous loss of heat. By the time the bucket reached the kitchen, arms burned and hands ached. But the water was there, and that meant cooking, washing, and life could continue. Chores filled the daylight hours. Snow had to be shoveled from paths leading to the barn, the outhouse, the gate. Letting snow piled too high made movement difficult and dangerous. Shovels were wooden, heavy, and rough. Each scoop took effort. Snow seemed light at first, then suddenly heavy, clinging to the blade, refusing to lift easily. Chopping wood followed. Axes were duller than ideal. Logs were frozen solid. Each swing sent shock through the arms. Missing the mark meant wasted energy. Striking true felt like a small victory. Wood split unevenly, stacked imperfectly, but it burned all the same. Inside the house, labor continued. Floors needed sweeping, even though coal dust returned almost immediately. Boots had to be dried carefully by the stove too close and they stiffened or scorched, too far and they stayed wet. Clothing needed mending. Buttons replaced. Holes patched. Christmas garments were not new purchases. They were improved versions of what already existed. Laundry did not pause for the holiday. Washing meant hauling more water, heating it slowly, scrubbing by hand, wringing fabric until fingers cramped. Clothes froze easily when hung outside, stiff as boards. Bringing them in too soon left them damp. Timing mattered. Everything required attention. Animals added to the workload. Chickens needed feeding. Livestock needed water that had not frozen. Stalls needed cleaning. Animals did not recognize Christmas. They required care every day, regardless of weather or celebration. Even those without farms faced endless maintenance. Stoves needed feeding. Fires needed watching. Roofs needed checking after heavy snow. Windows needed sealing against drafts. The house itself felt like something alive that required constant tending to keep winter out. Rest was earned in short moments. Standing near the stove, hands extended toward the heat. Sitting briefly after a long task. Leaning against a wall while boots dried. These moments were not lazy. They were necessary pauses to restore strength. Christmas offered no exemption. The holiday existed within this cycle of labor, not apart from it. In fact, Christmas often added work. Extra meals required extra preparation. Guests meant more cleaning, more water, more fuel. Decorations had to be made by hand. Trees had to be cut, carried, secured. Nothing appeared without effort. Children learned this early. Christmas joy was tied directly to work. Helping meant the holiday happened, at all. Small hands carried small loads. Small shoulders shoveled short paths. Everyone contributed what they could. Complaints were rare, not because work was easy, but because it was expected. Winter taught acceptance. Fighting it wasted energy. Enduring it built rhythm. Tasks were completed not with enthusiasm, but with steadiness. One thing at a time. One step after another. There was pride in this. Not loud pride, but quiet satisfaction. A cleared path. A warm stove. A full woodpile. These were achievements. Proof that the household was ready to face another night of cold. Christmas did not remove hardship, but it softened its edges. Working together mattered more during the holidays. Tasks were shared. Laughter slipped in between efforts. Someone told a story while chopping wood. Someone hummed while sweeping. Small moments of warmth appeared where none were expected. Even exhaustion felt different. At the end of a long day, bodies ached. Muscles were tired. Hands were rough and cracked. But there was comfort in being done. In knowing that everything necessary had been handled, at least for now. Evening brought relief. Darkness fell early, limiting what could be done. Candles were lit. The stove glowed steadily. People gathered closer. Work slowed not because it was finished, but because it could wait until morning. Christmas evenings were quieter because labor had already taken so much energy. Conversations were gentle. Games were slow. Stories were told without hurry. The body demanded rest, and rest was respected. Labor shaped memory. Years later, people did not remember specific gifts as clearly as they remembered carrying water through snow, chopping wood by lamplight, or standing together in the kitchen while boots dried by the fire. These actions anchored Christmas in reality. The holiday was not separate from life. It was life, intensified by winter. And within that constant labor, meaning grew. Helping mattered. Endurance mattered. Contribution mattered. Christmas was not something given. It was something built one task, one chore, one cold morning at a time. In early 1900s America, survival itself was a shared accomplishment. And Christmas, quietly, humbly, marked that accomplishment. In early 1900s America, Christmas was never experienced alone. Even in the coldest winters, even in the most isolated places, the season carried an expectation of gathering. Community was not optional. It was woven into survival itself, and Christmas made that truth especially visible. When December arrived, families did not retreat inward. They prepared to go out. Church was at the center of this movement. Not only as a place of faith, but as a place of warmth, routine, and shared presence. Attending Christmas services was not always easy. but it was rarely questioned. The effort required only reinforced its importance. Getting to church began hours before the service itself. Layers were added carefully, one after another. Sunday coats came out heavier, longer, often worn only on special occasions. Scarves were wrapped tighter. Boots were cleaned as best they could be, though traces of snow and mud always remained. Children were inspected carefully for missing buttons, torn seams, or cold ears. Then the door opened. Cold rushed in immediately, sharp and unapologetic. The walk to church was rarely short. Snowbanks lined roads. Wind cut through open spaces. Each step required attention, balance, and patience. Families moved together, not only for companionship, but for safety. In towns with horses or sleighs, the journey was different, but no easier. Sleigh rides were cold, bumpy, and loud. Bells jingled softly, mixing with the sound of runners scraping over packed snow. Blankets were shared. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth were passed around as small sources of comfort. Faces went numb quickly. Breath froze on scarves. The romance often imagined later was brief. The reality was endurance. Arriving at church felt like crossing a threshold. Cold air clung to coats and boots as people stepped inside. The building was warmer than outside, but still far from comfortable. Heat was uneven. Drafts crept in through doors and windows. Wooden pews were cold at first touch. As the room filled, warmth grew slowly. Bodies close together made a difference. Breath, movement, and shared presence raised the temperature just enough to take the edge off. Wool coats released the scent of snow and smoke. Candles flickered, casting soft light across familiar faces. Church was one of the few places where the entire community gathered at once. Neighbors who lived miles apart stood side by side. Families who rarely had time to visit exchanged quiet greetings. Children fidgeted. Elders settled carefully. Everyone adjusted layers, unwrapped scarves, rubbed hands together. The service itself was calm and measured. Voices joined in familiar songs. Hymns echoed softly, sometimes off-key, sometimes wavering, but always sincere. Music did not aim for perfection. It aimed for participation. Singing together mattered more than how it sounded. The Christmas story was told again, slowly, deliberately. It was a story people knew well, but hearing it in winter gave it weight. Ideas of shelter, warmth, and shared hardship felt immediate and personal. The message was not abstract. It mirrored daily life. When the service ended, people did not rush away. Leaving meant returning to the cold. Conversations lingered. Small exchanges happened, news shared, weather discussed, offers made to check on someone later. These moments mattered. They strengthened bonds that winter would test again and again. Outside the church, paths crossed. Families regrouped. Children ran briefly, then slowed as the cold reminded them of its presence. Sleighs creaked. Boots crunched. The journey home began, quieter now, softened by shared experience. Christmas gatherings extended beyond church. Neighbors visited one another's homes throughout the season. These visits required planning and effort. Walking through snow after dark was not casual. Lanterns were lit. Routes were known. Time was considered carefully. Arriving at a neighbor's home brought immediate relief. Warmth spilled out as the door opened. Boots were stamped clean. Coats were hung in crowded piles. Scarves and hats filled baskets. The air inside smelled of food, smoke, and familiar homes. Hospitality was expected, even when resources were limited. Coffee was poured. Bread was offered. Sometimes cookies appeared. Sometimes pie, saved carefully for visitors. No one expected extravagance. What mattered was the gesture. Conversation filled the room. Stories were told and retold. News traveled this way. Weather, work, family matters, everything passed through spoken word. Laughter came easily in these moments, breaking through winter's heaviness. Games followed. Cards, board games, simple contests using household items. Children played on the floor. Adults watched, joined in when energy allowed. The stove worked steadily, its glow anchoring the room. Christmas gatherings were not silent, but they were not loud either. They had a steady rhythm. Talk, pause, listen. The sound of cups touching tables. The creak of chairs. Occasional laughter. The quiet satisfaction of being together while winter pressed against the walls. Community also showed itself through obligation. If someone was ill, others checked in. If snow blocked a path, neighbors helped clear it. If fuel ran low, sharing was discussed. Winter demanded cooperation, and Christmas reminded people of that truth. Children experienced this sense of community deeply. They were expected to participate, singing carols, greeting elders, helping serve food. These actions were not performances. They were lessons. Lessons in belonging. Caroling itself was a form of shared endurance. Groups moved, from house to house, voices rising into cold night air. Songs drifted softly across snow-covered yards. Doors opened. Smiles appeared. Treats were sometimes offered. Other times, only thanks. Caroling was not about musical excellence. It was about presence. Standing together in the cold, singing familiar songs, sharing brief moments of warmth. The discomfort became part of the memory. Cold fingers, numb noses, tired legs, all softened by laughter and shared purpose. Christmas gatherings also extended within the home. Extended family arrived when possible. Cousins, grandparents, distant relatives. Homes grew crowded. Space shrank. Noise increased. Privacy disappeared. But this closeness mattered. It created shared memory. Children slept wherever there was room. Adults adjusted. Everyone accepted inconvenience because togetherness carried value. Even conflict had its place. Disagreements arose. Opinions clashed. Long-standing tensions resurfaced briefly. But winter limited escalation. Cold encouraged resolution. Staying warm together required cooperation. By evening, gatherings settled into calm. People grew tired. The stove glowed steadily. Candles burned low. Guests prepared to leave, bundling themselves once more. Goodbyes were slower, warmer than hellos. Stepping back into the cold was never pleasant. But it was easier knowing others were nearby, facing the same winter, carrying the same routines. Community was not abstract in early 1900s America. It was physical. It involved walking, carrying, sharing space. It demanded effort. Christmas amplified this effort, making connection visible through action rather than words. There were no digital messages, no distant acknowledgments. If you wanted to be part of Christmas, you showed up. You walked through snow. You sang despite cold lungs. You opened your door. You made room. And in doing so, you reinforced something essential. That winter could be faced together. That hardship was lighter when shared. That Christmas, at its core, was not about isolation or escape. It was about gathering. And in the quiet glow of stoves and candles, surrounded by familiar voices, that gathering became its own kind of warmth. In early 1900s America, Christmas decorations were not bought. They were made. The season did not arrive in boxes pulled down from an attic filled with matching ornaments and carefully coordinated colors. It arrived gradually, shaped by hands, patience, and whatever materials happened to be available. Decoration was not a separate activity. It was something folded into everyday life, done slowly, often in the evenings, after work was finished and bodies had begun to rest. The Christmas tree itself was usually the first step. Trees were not chosen from neat rows under electric lights. They were found. Someone, often a father, an older sibling, or a willing neighbor, walked out into nearby woods or fields and selected a modest evergreen. Perfection was not expected. Trees leaned. Branches were uneven. Bald spots were common. The tree was dragged home through snow, shedding needles along the way, leaving a faint trail that lingered until spring. It smelled sharp and green, carrying the outdoors inside. Snow melted onto the floor. Cold air followed it briefly through the open door. Getting the tree to stand was an exercise in improvisation. Buckets, bricks, blocks of wood, sometimes even shoes were used to prop it upright. Twine might be tied discreetly to a wall or coat rack. Once it stood, even slightly crooked, there was a quiet sense of achievement. The tree was not perfect, but it was there. Decorating came next, and it was rarely rushed. Ornaments were stored carefully throughout the year, wrapped in newspaper and tucked away in boxes that held decades of memory. Each piece had a story. A glass ball from a grandparent's youth. A tin star bent slightly out of shape. A fragile angel repaired more times than anyone could count. Children were involved in making decorations. Popcorn was strung onto thread, fingers sticky and clumsy. Cranberries joined the chains, bright against white kernels. These garlands were uneven, frequently interrupted by missing pieces quietly eaten during the process. They sagged under their own weight, but no one minded. Paper decorations appeared everywhere. Stars cut from scraps of paper. Chains stapled together from old schoolwork or store receipts. Glitter, coarse and persistent, found its way into hair, clothing, and corners of the house where it would remain long after Christmas ended. Salt dough ornaments were molded by hand. Simple shapes, bells, stars, figures baked slowly until hard. Sometimes holes for string were forgotten, turning ornaments into solid objects with no clear purpose. They were painted anyway, unevenly, faces ranging from cheerful to unintentionally solemn. These pieces were proudly displayed, no matter how lopsided. At the top of the tree sat an angel or star, often handmade. Pipe cleaners, fabric scraps, cotton, and wire were combined into something symbolic rather than precise. The angel leaned slightly. The star tilted. Both were secured with hope and careful balance. The final and most delicate step came last. Candles. Real wax candles, clipped directly onto branches. This moment transformed the tree from decoration into responsibility. Each candle was placed carefully, spaced to reduce risk, though no arrangement was ever completely safe. Someone always kept a bucket of water nearby. Another person stood ready with a damp cloth. Children were warned repeatedly to stay back. Lighting the tree was a quiet ceremony. The room dimmed. Matches were struck. Candles were lit one by one, hands steady, movements slow. The tree glowed softly, shadows dancing across the walls. For a few minutes, everything felt still. There was beauty in that glow. Not the bright, constant shine of electric lights, but something warmer, more fragile. The flicker of flames reflected in glass ornaments. The scent of pine mixed with warm wax. The room felt smaller, closer, held together by light. And always, beneath the beauty, there was tension. Candles burned quickly. Wax dripped. Branches dried out faster than expected. Someone inevitably noticed a faint smell and leaned closer, checking. The admiration lasted only a few minutes before candles were extinguished again. The tree was admired briefly, then returned to a state of watchful safety. Throughout the season, decoration stayed modest. Mantels held simple arrangements. Paper stars taped to walls. Evergreen branches tucked into jars. Ribbons reused year after year. There was no excess because excess required effort, time, and resources better spent elsewhere. Windows sometimes held candles too, set in holders, burning for short periods in the evening. They signaled warmth inside. They marked the season quietly, visible from the dark outside. Children noticed these details deeply. They remembered how the tree smelled, how the candles looked, how the ornaments felt fragile in their hands. The decorations became landmarks of memory, not because they were perfect, but because they were familiar. Decorating was not about impressing anyone. Visitors did not expect uniformity or abundance. They recognized the same handmade garlands in their own homes. They noticed the same slightly crooked angels, the same popcorn strings. Decoration was a shared language. It said, "We are here. We made time. We marked this moment." Even the imperfections carried meaning. A bent ornament meant it had survived another year. A faded paper star meant it had been loved before. Nothing was disposable. Everything had a past. As days passed, the decorations became part of the house. Pine needles fell slowly, gathering beneath the tree. Wax dripped onto the floor, hardened, and was scraped away later. Glitter migrated endlessly, settling into corners and clothing. The tree itself aged visibly. Branches drooped. Needles browned. The scent softened. By the end of the season, the tree looked tired, but still proud. It had done its job. Taking the tree down was a quiet, reflective task. Ornaments were removed carefully, wrapped again in newspaper. Popcorn strings were eaten by pets or discarded. The angel was placed back in its box, slightly bent, waiting patiently for another year. The tree was carried back outside, leaving behind needles that would be discovered for months. And yet, even after it was gone, Christmas lingered. The memory of candlelight remained. The softness of handmade decorations stayed in the mind. The knowledge that beauty had been created not by buying, but by doing. In early 1900s America, decorations were not about filling space. They were about intention. They marked the season quietly, without demanding attention. They required participation, care, and awareness. They carried risk and reward in equal measure. And in a world shaped by winter and labor, these small acts of making beauty felt meaningful. The candle-lit tree did not shine for long. But while it did, it held everything that Christmas needed to be. Warmth, effort, togetherness. And then, gently, it faded back into memory. In early 1900s America, Christmas stockings were not decorations. They were ordinary socks. Wool socks, cotton socks, mended socks, sometimes mismatched, often patched, always reused. These were the same socks worn through winter days and nights, carefully washed, dried by the stove, and then hung by the fireplace with quiet hope. There were no matching holders or themed designs. Stockings were hung on nails hammered into the mantel, draped over chair backs, or tied carefully with string. Placement mattered. Children believed that the closer a stocking was to the center of the fire, the better the chances of something special appearing inside. The fire itself was always burning nearby. This made the tradition both exciting and slightly dangerous. Parents warned children not to stand too close. Everyone kept an eye on the flames. The stocking swayed gently in the heat, drying out old wool and filling the room with a faint, familiar scent. The anticipation mattered more than the size. Children went to bed knowing that what might appear in the morning would be small. Expectations were carefully shaped long before December arrived. This was not a season of abundance, but of careful hope. Inside a stocking, gifts were practical. Oranges were treasures. Bright, round, heavy in the hand. In winter, fresh fruit felt like something miraculous. Nuts followed walnuts, hazelnuts, sometimes peanuts still in their shells, rattling softly when the stocking was shaken. Peppermint sticks appeared occasionally. Thick, sturdy, meant to last. Children sucked on them slowly, careful not to bite, knowing they might be the only sweet for days. Sometimes there was a small piece of hard candy, saved from another occasion and wrapped carefully in paper. Coins sometimes appeared at the bottom. A shiny penny or nickel, polished until it caught the light. These coins were rarely spent quickly. They were examined, turned over, sometimes saved as keepsakes rather than currency. Practical items were common. Handkerchiefs. Small combs. A pair of mittens folded neatly. Sometimes, ironically, new socks replaced the old ones that had just been hung. Children learned early to smile and say thank you, understanding that usefulness mattered. There was always the possibility of disappointment. A stocking might feel lighter than hoped. Candy could be older than expected. Nuts might be fewer. Occasionally, a symbolic lump of coal appeared half joke, half lesson. Yet disappointment was rarely loud. Children were taught to accept what arrived. Gratitude was not optional. It was woven into the ritual. Complaints were discouraged, not with harshness, but with quiet reminders of effort and intention. Beyond stockings, gifts under the tree were few. They were wrapped in newspaper, tied with string. The rustle of paper replaced the crinkle of modern wrapping. Headlines from yesterday became temporary decoration. Everyone opened gifts together. This mattered. The shared moment was more important than individual excitement. Families watched one another's reactions, smiled at polite surprise, laughed at awkward shapes. Homemade gifts dominated. Knitted mittens in colors that did not quite match. Scarves slightly too short or too long. Wooden toys carved by hand, uneven but solid. Dolls sewn from scraps of fabric. Faces stitched with careful concentration. Each gift carried visible labor. Children understood this instinctively. They recognized the time spent knitting by lamplight. The hours sanding wood. The patience required to finish something imperfect. Books appeared occasionally. Second-hand, edges worn, pages yellowed. They were treated with care, read slowly, sometimes shared between siblings. A book was not just entertainment, it was a companion through long winter evenings. Food gifts also appeared. A small tin of candy. A piece of homemade cake. Occasionally, the infamous fruitcake, dense, heavy, passed between relatives year after year. It was accepted with mixed feelings and polite smiles. There was laughter, but it was gentle. Christmas morning did not explode with noise. It unfolded. Children sat close together, legs tucked in, holding gifts carefully, inspecting them rather than tearing them apart. The room filled with warmth. Not just from the stove, but from shared presence. Parents watched quietly, satisfied not by abundance, but by seeing contentment take shape. Gifts were put to use immediately. Mittens pulled on. Toys tested. Dolls placed gently nearby. Nothing was set aside for later. Everything was meant to be lived with. The wrapping paper was saved. String was wound neatly and reused. Newspaper folded, back into usefulness. Waste was avoided without discussion, it was simply how things were done. By mid-morning, the excitement softened. Children settled into play. Adults returned to quiet conversation. The gifts became part of the house, not objects to be admired, but tools for daily life. Memory formed in these moments. Years later, people remembered not the number of gifts, but how they felt holding them. The smell of wool. The weight of an orange. The sound of paper tearing, slowly. Christmas in the early 1900s taught restraint. It taught appreciation. It taught that joy could exist in small, well-used things. And when the stockings were taken down, folded, and returned to their usual purpose, something lingered. The understanding that what mattered was not what was given, but the care behind it. In that quiet exchange, Christmas found its meaning. In early 1900s America, Christmas dreams did not arrive through screens. They arrived through paper. Thick paper. Heavy paper. Pages bound together into a catalog so large it could stop a door from swinging shut. The Sears, Roebuck catalog was not just a shopping tool. It was an event. When it arrived, it landed on the kitchen table with a solid thump. Everyone noticed. Children gathered around it immediately, fingers already smudged with coal dust and ink. Adults pretended not to care, but they watched too. Because inside that book was something rare in a hard winter season. Possibility. The catalog was massive. Page after page of items that felt impossibly distant from everyday life. Shoes that looked sturdy and new. Coats without patches. Tools that gleamed. And then, tucked deeper inside, the pages that mattered most to children. The toy section. Here, imagination ran free. There were train sets with shining tracks. Wagons made of painted metal. Dolls with eyes that opened and closed. Marbles in colors children had never seen outside of dreams. There were sleds with smooth runners. Rocking horses carved to look almost alive. Each image felt like a window. Children studied these pages carefully. They memorized page numbers. They learned descriptions by heart. They traced pictures with their fingers, careful not to tear the thin paper. The ritual was familiar. Pencils were brought out. Sometimes one pencil was shared between several siblings. Circles were drawn around desired items. Some children circled everything. Others were more cautious, choosing one or two items and marking them carefully, as if too much hope might ruin the chances. Older children learned strategy. They circled modest items. They underlined practical ones. They added notes in the margins. This one is small. This one would last. They were already learning how to negotiate dreams within reality. Younger children circled freely. Entire pages. Toys, tools, furniture, even farm equipment. Their dreams were expansive and unfiltered. And the catalog absorbed them all without judgment. Parents observed quietly. They understood the gap between what was wanted and what could be given. The catalog was not a promise. It was a conversation starter. At dinner, questions appeared. So what are you hoping for this year? Children answered carefully. Some listed everything they had circled. Others named one item, pretending not to care too much. Everyone knew that money was limited, though few fully understood how limited. Shipping was uncertain. Orders took weeks. Sometimes months. Trains were delayed. Packages arrived late, damaged, or not at all. The phrase "we will see" carried weight. But anticipation was part of the joy. For weeks, the catalog stayed close. On the table. Under pillows. Beside beds. Pages bent and worn from constant handling. Corners softened. Ink faded slightly where fingers lingered too long. Children talked about the items endlessly. What they would do with a sled. How fast it would go. Where they would ride it. How a train set might circle the floor. How a doll might sit by the stove during long evenings. Arguments broke out. Who would get what? Whose choice was better? Whether a certain toy was too childish or too grown up. The catalog became a shared language of longing. Even disappointment was expected. Deep down, children knew that most of what they circled would never arrive. They learned to narrow their hopes, quietly adjusting expectations as December progressed. Still, they circled. Because the act itself mattered. The catalog allowed children to imagine a Christmas that could be larger than their daily reality. Even if nothing arrived, the dreaming had already done its work. Adults understood this too. They remembered their own childhood catalogs. Their own circled pages. The toys they never received but never forgot. When Christmas morning came, the gifts rarely matched the catalog exactly. But sometimes, something close appeared. A wooden version instead of a metal one. A handmade doll instead of a store-bought one. A sled simpler than the picture, but strong. Children recognized the effort. They saw the connection between the dream and the reality. They learned that imagination could shape joy even when circumstances limited choice. The catalog was eventually put away. It slid under the table. It became a booster seat. A doorstop. A sketchbook. Its life continued long after Christmas. But its impact lingered. It taught children how to want without demanding. How to hope without expecting. How to imagine beyond the boundaries of daily life. In a world of cold floors and heavy chores, the Sears catalog offered warmth of a different kind. The warmth of possibility. And for a few weeks each year, that was enough. In early 1900s America, Christmas gifts were rarely surprising in size. They were surprising in intention. There were no towering piles beneath the tree. No colorful wrapping paper glittering in the lamplight. What waited instead were modest shapes, uneven bundles, carefully tied with string and wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. The sound of Christmas morning was not tearing. It was rustling. Paper folded back slowly. Knots untied with careful fingers. Headlines revealed, briefly before being set aside. News of distant places gave way to something closer and more personal. Every gift carried weight. Not physical weight, but effort. Many gifts had begun weeks earlier, sometimes months earlier, long before December arrived. Knitting needles moved in the evenings after chores were done. Hands carved wood near the stove. Fabric scraps were gathered, sorted, reused. Time was the real currency. Mittens were common gifts. Wool mittens, thick and warm, often mismatched in color. One thumb slightly longer than the other. The stitches uneven in places where the knitter had grown tired or distracted. They were tried on immediately. Fingers flexed. Warmth tested. Scarves followed. Sometimes too short to wrap properly. Sometimes so long they dragged. They smelled faintly of wool, soap, and the house they were made in. These were not accessories. They were armor. Socks appeared frequently. Heavy, durable, unmistakably handmade. Receiving socks was expected. Children nodded politely, knowing they would wear them every day whether they liked them or not. Socks were not exciting. But they were necessary. And necessity carried its own respect. Wooden toys were treasured. A carved horse with legs that did not quite match. A spinning top that leaned slightly to one side. A toy wagon that creaked when pulled. These toys were simple. But they were strong. They were meant to last. Dolls were sewn by hand. Fabric bodies stuffed with cotton or scraps. Faces stitched carefully. Expressions calm and neutral. Hair made from yarn, often slipping loose with use. These dolls did not speak or blink. They listened. Books appeared occasionally. Second-hand. Pages yellowed. Corners worn. Sometimes inscribed inside with a name or a date. Books were opened gently. Respected as something fragile and valuable. Food gifts filled the gaps. Small tins of candy. Homemade cookies wrapped in cloth. Pieces of cake carefully cut and shared. And sometimes, inevitably, fruitcake. Fruitcake was accepted with polite humor. Dense. Heavy. Passed from hand to hand. A slice taken slowly. It was less about enjoyment and more about tradition. Fruitcake symbolized endurance. Much like winter itself. Gifts were opened together. This mattered deeply. No one rushed ahead. No one disappeared into a corner. Families sat in a circle. Watching one another. Reactions were shared. Gratitude was public. Children learned how to receive. They learned to smile, to thank, to hold something gently even if it was not what they had imagined. They learned that disappointment did not mean disrespect. Parents watched closely, not for excitement, but for understanding. They looked for appreciation, not enthusiasm. They knew what each gift had cost in time and effort. There was pride in giving. A father watched a child play with a carved toy. A mother adjusted a scarf around a neck. A grandparent nodded quietly as mittens were pulled on. These moments mattered more than words. Nothing was discarded. Wrapping paper was folded neatly and saved. String was wound and reused. Newspaper returned to practical life. Waste was avoided not because it was taught, but because it was understood. Gifts were used immediately. Mittens worn. Toys tested. Books opened and read aloud. Nothing waited for later. There was no shelf life for joy. The house settled after unwrapping. The excitement softened into comfort. Children played quietly. Adults talked. The stove crackled steadily. The gifts blended into daily life. No longer special objects, but familiar companions. Memory formed here. Not in the moment of opening, but in the hours that followed. In the feel of new wool against skin. In the sound of a wooden toy on the floor. In the sight of a book resting beside the bed. These gifts were not collected. They were lived with. Years later, people remembered these gifts not by name, but by feeling. They remembered who made them, where they sat, how they were held. Christmas in the early 1900s did not teach abundance. It taught attention. Attention to effort. To intention. To the quiet ways people show care when resources are limited but love is not. And when the day moved on, and the gifts took their place among ordinary things, something remained. The understanding that value is not measured by quantity, but by the hands that shaped it. In that understanding, Christmas found a deeper meaning. One that lingered long after the paper was folded away. Christmas in early 1900s America was never just about celebration. It was about endurance. By the time the holiday arrived, families had already survived weeks of cold, long nights, heavy labor, and limited resources. The season did not pause daily life, it layered itself on top of it. Every tradition existed alongside work. Coal still had to be hauled, wood still had to be chopped, snow still had to be shoveled, animals still needed feeding, water still had to be carried in from frozen pumps. Christmas did not cancel hardship. It softened it. Family gatherings were crowded and imperfect. Relatives arrived bundled in wool, shaking snow from boots, bringing with them the smells of cold air, damp coats, and familiar perfume. Coats piled up in corners, chairs were pulled closer together. Someone always ended up sitting on the floor. The house grew warmer. Not just from the stove, but from bodies gathered close. Voices overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. Conversations repeated stories that everyone had heard before, but still wanted to hear again. Games filled the evening. Cards smudged with fingerprints. Checkers played with mismatched pieces. Board games worn thin from years of use. Rules were bent. Arguments flared briefly, then faded. Food circulated constantly. Plates of cookies. Slices of bread. Pickles, cheese, leftover ham. Coffee refilled again and again. No one kept track of portions. Sharing was assumed. Children drifted between rooms. They played quietly, then loudly, then quietly again. Toys were passed around. New mittens were tested. Dolls were tucked under arms. Wooden toys clattered across floors. The adults watched. Sometimes with smiles, sometimes with tired eyes. They had worked hard to reach this moment. Not to create perfection, but to create togetherness. Church pageants followed. Children dressed as sheep, angels, wise men, or trees. Costumes were improvised from bedsheets, cotton balls, paper crowns. Lines were forgotten. Songs went off key. Candles flickered too close to curtains. The audience loved every second. Mistakes were met with applause. Laughter softened embarrassment. Photographs captured blurred faces and half-closed eyes, preserving chaos rather than control. Bathing became another ritual. Tin tubs filled slowly. Water heated carefully. Family members took turns, each one braving cold air and harsh soap. Cleanliness was brief but meaningful. Being presentable for the holidays mattered. Illness moved quietly through houses. Coughs echoed at night. Remedies were applied with faith rather than certainty. Camphor, homemade syrups, mustard plasters. People endured and recovered or simply endured. No one expected perfection. Health, like warmth, came and went. As Christmas passed, life resumed its rhythm. Chores returned immediately. Snow fell again. Paths needed clearing. Fires needed feeding. The holiday did not stop winter, it simply reminded people they could survive it together. Visiting neighbors followed. Families trudged through snow to exchange cookies, songs, and polite judgment. Hospitality was expected. Doors opened. Warmth was shared briefly, then returned. Carolers sang off key under the stars. Breath fogged the air. Snow squeaked under boots. Windows glowed from within. Some doors opened gladly. Others stayed shut. Still, the singing continued. The season slowly wound down. Decorations were taken down carefully. Ornaments wrapped in paper and stored away. Trees were removed, needles lingering long after. Glitter clung stubbornly to everything. The house felt quieter. Larger. Emptier. Yet also settled. New Year arrived without spectacle. No fireworks. No countdowns. Just quiet reflection by the fire. Resolutions spoken softly. Hopes kept modest. Another winter lay ahead. But Christmas had done its work. It had reminded families that joy did not require abundance, that warmth could be created. That meaning could be found in routine, repetition, and shared effort. Children grew older remembering these seasons. They remembered cold floors and heavy quilts. The smell of coal smoke. The feel of wool against skin. The sound of paper rustling. The weight of an orange in a stocking. They remembered not what they received, but how they felt. Safe. Included. Necessary. Christmas in early 1900s America was not easy. It was practical, demanding, sometimes uncomfortable. But it was real. And within that reality, people found something enduring. Connection. Community. The quiet strength of showing up for one another, year after year, through cold nights and long winters. And so, as the house settles into silence, as the fire dims and the wind presses softly against the windows, you can imagine what it felt like to lie beneath heavy quilts, listening to the sounds of an old house breathing through the night. No glowing screens. No rushing tomorrow. Just warmth earned, rest deserved, and another winter survived. History is often remembered for its grand events. But sometimes, its truest stories live in small rooms. Around quiet tables. Where ordinary people found comfort in being together. So tonight, let those moments drift gently past you. The cold outside. The warmth within. And the calm knowledge that even in the hardest seasons, people have always found ways to create light. Sleep well. And when you are ready, we will wander through another quiet corner of history together. Crescent moon.